I've often said to teachers that it is an unfortunate thing that a Sunday school teacher is called a Sunday school teacher. And just by the way, there's an equal but opposite problem with small group leaders I'll get to in a moment. But it is an unfortunate thing that a Sunday school teacher is called a Sunday school teacher because you are called a Sunday school teacher, you might get the idea that your job is, and your only job is, to teach. And I have never met a pastor anywhere. I've never met a minister of education or a discipleship pastor or a small group pastor who thought that the only job of the small group leader, the Sunday school teacher, was to teach. And in small group world, we tend to not call that person a teacher. We tend to call that person a leader. We call them typically a small group leader. And this has an equal but opposite problem. In fact, I've heard trainers say over the years, we don't actually want teachers. What we want is facilitators. And I want you to look at the Wikipedia definition of a facilitator. It is someone who engages in facilitation, any activity that makes a social process easy or easier. A facilitator often helps a group of people to understand their common objections and assist them to plan how to achieve these objections. And in doing so, notice this next line, the facilitator remains neutral, meaning he or she does not take a particular position in the discussion. And teacher, I want you to take a particular position in the discussion. I want you to come to the class with a passion. I want you to come to the class with a burden. I want you to come to the class with an idea that you want to communicate to your people. And you may communicate to the people. In fact, I would encourage you to communicate this to the people through a question and answer format. I believe we're changed more by what we say, what comes out of our mouth, than what we hear. And people will not really change until they speak the truth. And so I'm a big believer in a question and answer way of teaching, but this is very different than the idea of a facilitator who simply leads in a discussion without any particular opinion as to the outcome. The Bible says it is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. And we want to avoid two extremes here, and that is to see ourselves only as a teller of truth, a deliverer of information. And that's one extreme we want to avoid. The other extreme we want to avoid is that we don't emphasize truth enough, and we see ourselves simply as a facilitator of a group discussion. And the truth is, the small group is not just a small group. The church exists on several levels. It exists as a universal, invisible church kind of level. When Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." He was talking about the invisible, universal church, and that's one aspect of the church. But truthfully, it's not the primary aspect. Then the church exists, and we classically think of it as the local church or the congregational style meeting. And in this worship service style setting, we have typically a professional who is doing the teaching and a professional who is leading in the worship time. But the church exists on another level, and that is it exists at the small group level. The Bible says day after day in the temple courts, that was those congregational style meetings, and from house to house. And whether those groups meet at a house or whether they meet at a church building, that small group setting is an expression of the church. It is not a ministry of the church. It is an expression of what the church is. And I know we are a little confused on this from time to time. I remember being at a restaurant one time, and I was there with a parent, and his grown children showed up, and he says to his grown children, "Did y'all go to Sunday school today, or did you just go to church?" Now I want you to listen to the thought behind that statement. The thought behind that statement is church is what we do in the auditorium. Church is what we do when the pastor is leading. Church is what we do when the minister of music is leading. That's church. In Sunday school, small group is kind of optional. And I think many people see this that this way, that their small group is kind of a optional kind of aspect of ministry. But in the New Testament, day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, the church never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. And whether that church meets in a congregational style meeting, and whether that church meets in a small group style meeting, and whether that is in a Sunday school style meeting or a home group style style meeting, that small group is an expression of the church. In fact, I would even argue that most of what it means to be a church, most of the purposes of the church are accomplished best in a small group. Rick Warren made famous the 5 purposes of the church, and truth be told, there's nothing particularly controversial. Few things controversial, so some people perceive some things controversial about Rick Warren, but one of them is not about the 5 purposes of the church that he teaches. These were the same 5 purposes that I was taught in a systematic theology class when I was seminary, probably the same things he was been taught by teachers down through the centuries. And let me be clear, I'm not being critical of Rick Warren. I think he would not pretend that he has invented these 5 purposes, but simply emphasize that the church ought to be driven by its purposes, not driven by its programs or its personalities or some other things that he mentions. And at the small group level, at the Sunday school class level, you, leader, are the pastor of that small group and ought to lead that small group to function in a biblically balanced, functioning way, that you ought to accomplish all 5 of these purposes. And I want to talk to you briefly about these 5 purposes. The first one is fellowship. This is the one that we do the best and the one the congregational style meeting does the worst. It's very difficult for a congregational style meeting to have true fellowship. But it's very easy. In fact, it's one of the things that Sunday school classes and small groups do best, and you ought to lean into this. And what this means is, every now and then, I can't remember if I told you this story last week or I told it in another setting. But a few weeks ago, I was in a group, and the subject came up. The passage was 2 Corinthians, where it talks about we comfort others with the comfort we ourselves have received. And so we got to talking about that, the idea that the things that we have gone through enable us to comfort others. And one of the men brought up the fact that his daughter died a few years ago. And I had heard that, but really didn't know the story. And so I turned to him and I said, "Tell me that story." And it was a very touching moment. And I think a moment that many of us will, those of us in that group today, that day, will long remember. And every now and then in your class, you ought to let that thing percolate up. My Sunday school teacher often will start just a few minutes late intentionally, and he'll let people just small talk and share with one another what's going on in their lives just a little bit. Now, it is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. We don't want the whole time to just be sitting and chatting, but spending a little bit of time with that. A lot of groups have refreshments and encourage people to come a little bit early and talk. It's one of the things that home groups have over a Sunday school style group, simply because they have more time to work with. Typical home group, oftentimes you'll have a meal, and then you'll have a teaching time, and oftentimes people will stay around afterwards. And sometimes it'll be a 2 or 3 hour meeting. Now, to be fair, oftentimes home groups are only meeting every other month. Sometimes they take off for the summer, and so there's some other pluses and minuses that way. But I simply want to say that the fellowship time is an important part of what you're trying to do. You teacher, you small group leader, are trying to lead your group into deeper and deeper fellowship. Second purpose of the church is discipleship, and we accomplish this primarily through our teaching, by teaching them to obey, by application-driven teaching, by showing them how they can live the John 10:10 Christian life, how they can live a life marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. I think I got those in the wrong order, by the way. I think it's faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But at any rate, we're trying to lead people into that life through application-driven teaching. So the first one is fellowship, and then discipleship, and the third purpose of your group is ministry. That is, we ought to do some service, is what we mean by ministry in this context. And we will encourage our people to have a servant's heart and serve the people in their world. And then from time to time, you ought to do a ministry project in your group. Have your group go out and serve somebody in some way. Fourth purpose of the group, and we're going to be talking about this more next week, and that is evangelism. And I believe you ought to set your purpose to try to double your class every 2 years or less. A group of 10 that doubles every 18 months will reach 1,000 people for God in 10 years. And there's a worldwide movement by which this is happening. I'm going to share with you some of those stories next week. The summary of how you can get this done is you can double your class every 2 years or less by inviting every member and every prospect to every fellowship every month. Have a party of some kind, and the party, in fact, could be a service project, but some kind of activity outside of class once a month. And on that month, you have a list of everyone who attends your your group, a list of everyone who you'd like to attend that group, and you invite them. And I've seen it happen more times than I can count. If you get them to be a part of the group, you get them to come to the fellowship, they will become a part of the group, and oftentimes will come to your class. And it's one of the best ways for your group to participate in evangelism. I believe you ought to lead your people to know how to speak the words of evangelism. We tend to delegate this into an evangelism class somewhere, but as the topic comes up from time to time, I think you ought to ask the question, imagine that I am not a believer. Imagine that I don't know Christ. Tell me how I can place my faith in Christ. Tell me how I can become a Christian. And emphasize to people that it's not the doing plan. It's not the trying hard to be good plan. It's the receiving Christ's grace. It's accepting the fact that Christ has accepted me. It's calling upon the name of the Lord. It's believing in him. And as we do that, we become Christians. And we want everyone in your group to be ready to share the message about how we can become Christians. And then the last purpose of your small group, the last purpose of your Sunday school is to participate in worship. And this is probably the weakness of our Sunday school class as a structure, the small group. What I mean by that is it's one of the most difficult things for your small group. The strength is fellowship. It's easier for your group to do fellowship than for a large group to do fellowship. It's more difficult. The bigger the group, the easier the worship. But you can do this. You might just get a what we used to call a boom box and play some music and sing along with that. If it's a home group and you got a smart TV, you can sing along to Chris Tomlin. You may want to sing along. You may just want to watch a good Chris Tomlin or who your favorite artist is. And there's some good ones on there. Just do a search on YouTube for some of your favorite artists and spend a little time in worship. Worship doesn't have to be music. I remember in a group one time saying, let's spend some time in prayer. And this prayer, I want us to just worship the Lord in this prayer. And I want us to spend no time in this prayer thinking about our needs and thinking about the Aunt Susie who's a little bit sick. And we're going to get to that in a moment. And we're going to pray for them. And there's nothing wrong with interceding on behalf of other people. But let's just dedicate this time to just spending time thinking about and pondering the greatness and the goodness and how much we love the Lord. And I tell you, it's a funny experience because that group really struggled with that. You could tell they could almost hardly come up with anything to say. And I think it's a sad testimony to our groups if we cannot figure out how to just spend time worshiping the Lord in our prayer. And we tend to think of prayer just as asking for stuff. Before I leave, let me recommend one book, actually 3 books by Steve Gladen, who talks about these things, the purpose-driven small groups. And in the leading small groups with a purpose, he has a long section where he will spend 2 chapters on each one of these purposes. And he'll talk about some simple things and some more complicated things, some walk, run kind of things. And he has idea after idea after idea after idea, how you can accomplish the 5 purposes of the church through your microcosm of the church. And may God richly bless you as you do this, as you lead your group, not just to be a teaching platform, but to be a place where the 5 purposes of the church can be expressed in your microcosm of the church, your small group.